Girlhood is an anthem for women, a powerful exploration of the forces that seek to confine them, and a searing study of the transitions into and away from girlhood on a lifelong journey of discovery. Written with Melissa Febos' characteristic lyricism and searing insights, Girlhood blends investigative reporting, memoir, and scholarship to illustrate how she and others like her have reimagined relationships and made room for the anger, hurt, and grief women have long been taught to deny. Melissa Febos is the author of Whip Smart and Abandon Me, a Lambden Literary Award finalist and Publishing Triangle Award finalist. Her essays have appeared in Tin House, The Believer, The New York Times, and elsewhere. Melissa is the inaugural winner of the Jean Cordova Prize for Lesbian Queer Nonfiction from Lambda Literary, and the recipient of fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, the BAU Institute, the Barbara Deming Foundation, Vermont Studio Center, Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and others. She is an associate professor at the University of Iowa, where she teaches in the nonfiction writing program. Melissa, it is a thrill for me to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your book with our community.
Thank you so much, Linda. It's a thrill for me to be here tonight talking with Kelley.
And in conversation with Melissa is Kelley Griesmer. Kelley serves as the president and CEO of the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, a public foundation that is fiercely committed to igniting social change for the sake of gender equality. A bridge builder with an unwavering commitment to gender equity, inclusivity, and women's and girls' leadership, Kelley has a proven track record of creating opportunities and sparking change for women, girls, and families in Central Ohio. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism and history from Indiana University and a Juris Doctorate degree from the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Kelley, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Hi there. I'm so sorry. I said I'm going to have some lighting issues right away because of the sun setting, but that's okay.
No problem. Well, welcome. Thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us this evening. And now a warm welcome to Melissa Febos in conversation with Kelley Griesmer.
Thanks, Linda.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. So Melissa, thank you so much for sharing yourself in this book, because for those of us in this work every day, I think we realize that vulnerability is honestly the key to really any of the social change we want to create. And for you to have written the way that you have, it shows it's a real testament to how the rest of us have to behave. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful articulation of really sort of what I think of as one of the essential sort of projects and arguments of the book. So already, thank you for being an ideal reader.
Yeah, well, I will say I'm a fangirl, so I'll try to keep it under control here. But one of the things I thought we would start with, because the content of the book is intoxicating in a lot of ways, just the power that it brings. But the first thing that I was kind of surprised by is the fact that it's essays. I think a lot of times we don't pick up books and think, and I'll tell you, it caught me off guard. I'm the kind of person who gets something and I just start reading it and I'm like, wait, what am I reading? These chapters don't flow, right? And so tell me a little bit, just for those of, we want everyone to read this book, but for those people who haven't picked up a book of essays in a while, talk a little bit about why essays and why they help you so much.
Sure. Well, I think, sometimes we use the phrases, memoir, personal essay, essays sort of interchangeably. And the difference as I see it, and this is what I tell my students, because I primarily teach creative nonfiction, so I talk a lot about the differences between these things, is that the essay is interested in making an argument and in questions in addition to all of the concerns that it shares with memoir. And I think of memoir, and I, having written a very traditional memoir for my first book, as an art form that is concerned with making an argument. Sometimes it's concerned with a lot of things that essays are, but it's really about sort of telling a story. And so, I like the essay because it has room for the story, but it has room for sort of thinking on the page, rumination. And I think for this book in particular, and I will say that, when I talk to people about this book, some people call it a memoir, and my last book was sort of between a memoir and an essay collection. And there are some essay collections that have like book reviews and personal essays, and they're really sort of all over the place. And, I definitely am interested in telling a cohesive story, but I also wanted to be able to bring other voices into this book. And I interviewed lots of other women, and I brought research into it and some statistics and children's literature. And I really wanted to sort of be able to pull other things into my story. So while my story is definitely at the center of all of these essays, there are a lot of voices in here. It really feels sort of like a community told story in many ways. And the other thing that was really important to me was, I wanted to write about girlhood, but I wanted to write about it through the lens of my adult experience, looking backward, thinking about the ways that those experiences had informed all of the intervening years, and from a vantage point where I can really see the ways that they affected me, and where I can safely look back and maybe find a more honest version of those events than what I had to tell myself at the time when I was younger, So it was really important for me to be able to move everywhere in time in my life. And the essay felt like a form that had room for that.
Yeah, that's it's so funny that you went to that, because that sort of was my next question, which was, I think you pick up a book and it says girlhood, and we have a lot of donors that come to us and say, I want to invest in girls, and there's a thought about what you're going to read, and our research tells us that girls start to lose their confidence at age 8. And then there's a lot of head shaking and hands up in the air about why is that? And so I think there's a lot of people who might pick up Girlhood and think, okay, we're going to read about why girls start to fail. And how are we going to fix this? And instead,
that book.
No, it's not. So talk a little bit about that interrelationship of girlhood and womanhood, and how it all comes out. Yeah.
Sure. I think, it's interesting. I was just talking with my partner earlier today about how, when I first was sort of conceiving of this book, or in the process of writing it, or even like shortly after I finished writing it, I felt sort of ambivalent about the title Girlhood, because it seemed to suggest a certain thing, and it has these connotations which are not associated with my story. And what I came to is that I actually think it's a problem that the word girlhood makes us think of pink things and innocence and purity, and the ways that sort of capitalism has co-opted the term in order to sell us things and in order to sell us an idea about what girlhood is. And my book was very much trying to sort of bust out of that story and really pull into it the experiences that I think are actually quite ordinary, but that we don't like to talk about, and that we are afraid to speak about, because we don't talk about it, because it's not the image of girlhood, right? And so in some ways, I think we end up feeling alone in those experiences, right? And it isn't until I think we get into adulthood that we start to understand that other women had these experiences, and we start to have the conversations, and we start to be able to recover from those experiences in community. And so the idea of sort of isolating my girlhood, like I already did that in my mind, the idea of this book was really to take those experiences, to go back to that younger self and bring her into today and integrate her into my adult self, where I have the resources to really be able to look at and to heal from and to speak about those experiences. And that was sort of something I wanted to model and to offer to other women, because just like you said at the very beginning, I think it's the beginning of all social change, is that kind of vulnerability and integration, and really learning to love and accept our younger selves, and to not take on the responsibility for the ways that we were harmed and that we didn't know how to talk about when we were younger.
Yeah, and I thank you, you know, because I thought the quote, I mean, it's literally part of the title. Of the one essay, and I'm going to try to get it right. Thesmophoria.
As far as I know, that's right.
Okay, good. But it says, my darkness has become my work on this earth.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, you know, there's a lot of the reviews. I've never seen lyrical come up so often in reviews about a book, but that's what I felt. You know, when I was reading it, I felt like I was listening to music a lot. I'm a lyrics person, and and I was, you know, I was like, gosh, that really makes sense. But a line like that, you know, it says a lot. And it's that's the kind of thing that I think could scare someone, when you're literally saying my darkness. So
Yeah.
so when you start somewhere like that, and so people don't associate girlhood with your darkness. So talk a little bit about that work that you're doing, you know, that leads to these essays.
I think it scared me too, you know, and I'll be the first to say it. I have a pretty unconventional history in many ways. And I've written about a lot of that. And I definitely felt, I don't know, for a lot of my life, I felt like the ways that I felt driven to express myself, to find community, to sort of survive and treat and respond, or to silence my own feelings and reactions to the inexplicable aspects of human society, and the ways that my body was responded to in the world when I started to come of age sexually. And a lot of those behaviors, like secrecy, certain kinds of sexual behavior, fraught relationship to food, a lot of things, even sort of an obsessive, like kind of maniacal relationship to reading as a child. There's a way I thought, I think I'm maladjusted. Like, I have really nice parents. They're wonderful. And I am so weird and messed up because I do all of these weird things, and it doesn't seem normal, whatever my idea of that was, whatever people talk about, or what other people's lives look like from the outside. It just didn't match up with what was going on with me inside. And my journey as a person through my own life, and through sort of making art about my life, and through sort of recovery, all different kinds of recoveries. I've been sober for going on 18 years, but I've recovered from lots of other things too. And what all of that has taught me is that many of the behaviors and responses and feelings and thoughts that I had, that I thought were a maladjustment or self-destructive, and sometimes they were destructive in some ways, but they were never meant to be destructive, and they never were an expression of self-hatred or a desire to hurt other people. They were always, and often, a misguided attempt to survive and to manage experiences that were not given any kind of guidebook, that parents aren't given a guidebook for their own experience, let alone their kids' experience. And so I was really sort of doing the best I could to try to make it to adulthood intact, and the answer to whether I did or not is both sort of yes and no, right? Like, I was profoundly affected by all of those experiences that were not given a map for how to survive, but also partly because I had a really supportive family, partly because I sought survival in all of these sort of unconventional ways. I found a path to sort of reintegration and wholeness, and activism, writing, all of these ways I found to sort of survive that stuff.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit then about, and I want to be careful here, because we want, as I said, we want people to read the book. So I'm going to try not to be the spoiler person and tell all the stuff, but I do think it's, to talk, about a little bit about the different essays. And what comes up in a couple of them, I think, is sort of, I sort of thought of it as I was preparing, as the nature versus nurture collides, right? Because you talk a lot about what I think is often overlooked in the story of girlhood, which is that our girlhood is leading to adolescence, and there's a lot of bodily things, very marked natural things that happen to women. Their bodies change more decidedly, I think, in a lot of ways than a male's, in ways that our society has characterized as good or bad, early or late, these things. And so it made me think about this moment, where I think you're talking about this loss of control that it's not ours. We cannot control. For you, your body started to change at 11, I think, and in ways that were going to catch the attention of men in a society that has learned to value breasts and beauty and all these things. So at 11. And so it seems to me that, as a couple of the essays really root themselves in, once that happened, it didn't matter who you were. That's when the world started to define you.
That's right.
And so it's your experience, and I don't want to speak for you, but talk a little bit about, I think that if it is the nature versus nurture, the nature starts to cause the problem.
Right.
It causes the changes.
Right.
The hormones, the growth, everything. But then the nurture in a lot of ways kicks in, the way our society responds to those changes.
Right.
And then that's sort of where I thought the ball starts to unwind.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. And I think, puberty is hard. Like, we know this. It would be hard even if we didn't live in like a misogynistic patriarchal culture, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it, right? It's totally natural. There's lots of joy and pleasure and excitement and discovery that comes with that. And and I will also say, I also remember that time as a time, and this is something I also wanted to try to name in this book. And I'm going to come back to your nature nurture point, but is that it's also a time of intellectual and philosophical and growth in lots of different ways, right? And I remember at the time, like I said, I was this voracious reader, and I was reading, like, sometimes I look back at the things I was reading and I was like, I must not have understood like 75% of that, but I was just like Pac-Man with books. And I remember reading things and having ideas about humanity and existential thoughts and what does it all mean and what does my life mean and what is feminism, and I don't just like feeling like my brain was exploding with thoughts, and that being this really sort of sublime, overwhelming experience that was quite beautiful and kind of a form of joy. But similarly, there wasn't really a way to talk about that. Like, we don't really talk about what it feels like to be completely overwhelmed by your emotions or your intellectual thoughts. And we just don't, we live in a society where it's like, this is how you do things. You know what I mean? And we were in school, and I was like a really curious, assiduous, interested kid. And I had a hard time in school. Like, I got good grades always, but it just didn't, I was like, so I have all this stuff going on in here, and they're telling me that that's the place for this, but we're not talking about any of this stuff. We're not talking about like humanitarian crises or politics or how to be a writer, like what's going on, And I remember getting into like arguments in my health class about like birth control or like homosexuality, or I was just like, why am I the only person who's talking about this? And I know that there are other spaces and other communities where people are talking about it more so now, certainly, than in the late 80s. But it was sort of like there was so much that was beautiful and exhilarating and exciting and mystifying and scary about it, and I just didn't know where to put that, right? And I think in some ways that's why I became a writer, because I was like, okay, I don't know how to talk about this. I'll just start writing about it, or like listening to music and how that made me feel. Like, I didn't even know how to talk about that. Anyway, so, on top of all of that, to go from living in this family where I felt really loved and safe and supported and encouraged, and I lived in this like kind of rural space in my town where I was just like outside running around like a little wild animal all the time, and then suddenly it was like at school it wasn't okay to be a little wild animal anymore, and it wasn't okay to be like talking all the time like I wanted to be, and I was weird. And then when sexual attention started to happen, you know, it is such a radical shift to go from being a kid and all the ways that we treat kids, and we sort of cherish them and accept them and laugh off their weirdnesses, to being a girl in a different kind of way, was just shocking. I don't think there's any way I could have been prepared for that, especially, you know, I had breasts when I was in like the end of fourth grade, fifth grade. It was really early. I was the first one. And, you know, one of the things that was so comforting about writing this book was that I read all of this research, and it was like pretty much guaranteed that I had the social experience I did just based on that, you know, just based on developing early and sort of feeling, I already felt like an outsider because I was, you know, different in other kinds of ways. But that was just sort of cinched the deal, you know. And it's it's hard to be kind of an eccentric, weird, feral, intellectual child when all anybody wants is to fit in, you know. And there's a lot of sort of social policing that happens. And, you know, my book isn't necessarily the book that explains all of those social dynamics, but there are lots of amazing books, and we sort of know that happens. So I really wanted to write about it from the inside, right? What were those feelings? How can I put words to the things that really felt unspeakable when I was a kid, right? And how can I sort of go back to that nature and reorient myself to it? Because the nurture part really just came in and just squashed it and was like, nope, this is how you're going to relate to your body. This is how you're going to be in the world. This is what's important. And it took me, you know, decades to really circle all the way back around and be like, no, actually I get to say, you know, because that stuff really lingers.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, listen, we know this is uncomfortable. You know, I have said to people recently that, you know, there's really nothing different about talking about sexism than racism. You know, it's not gonna, there's no way I can sugarcoat this. And I've done it too. I mean, I think for women, and you talk a lot about this, that, you know, women are going to apply these standards, these norms, because we've also been ingrained with them. And, you know, you have this beautiful line about, you know, how could our mothers ever prepare us for this ocean that was coming at us? And whether we developed early or not, whether we had similar experiences, eventually we absorb these ideas. And
Yep.
and so how do we explain to people that, you know, things we continue to reward in little boys, we start to work out of little girls very quickly. So to your point, being feralish, you know, wild. How many times has somebody said, "Oh, they're boys, they're wild," and
Right.
yet if you're a girl who happens to be wild, people are like, "Ooh, she's trouble," you
Yep.
know, and
Yep.
that's uncomfortable for people because they don't want to admit that they've already made that judgment.
Right. So
And
deep. Yeah. We're just not even aware. And it, you know, on some level, I about a lot of this stuff, I thought I already knew that. Like I've been a feminist like my whole life, but knowing it, understanding the ways that media and marketing and the way it all just perpetuates these values and these ideas and how deeply we internalize them, it doesn't cure us of it. You know, like that's the sort of great frustration of my life, is that I have been like reading about feminism and knowing the history of it. And I grew up with like Ms. Magazine all over my house, and it didn't protect me like it couldn't. We're in the soup. And it is like racism in that way. Like we're breathing it, you know, like there is no way to protect ourselves from it. So the question then becomes, how do we live in it in a way that honors our truth and our bodies? And how do we liberate ourselves at the very same time that we're being bombarded our whole lives by it, you know?
yeah. So to Linda, just to Linda's credit, I'm going to make sure for those of you who are listening, we definitely want your questions. So start to toss those into the chat box, because this is going to go too quickly for me. And then I'm going to turn it, be asking your questions instead. But Melissa, I do want to talk about one of the chapters or one of the essays that I was the most struck by. And I think it speaks a lot to the social change that we have to create, not only in ourselves and this liberation that you're mentioning, that women, we need men to change the way that they're absorbing this information, because they're buying into a lot. And I think there was a line you said, that a lot of these men don't necessarily hate women when they do these things. They just value their own needs above all else.
Yeah. And we do too.
Right, right.
We do too. Yeah. That was like the thing, like patriarchy is bad for everybody. Even those who have more power than other people are harmed by it. They have essential parts of their true selves alienated from them, like it's just bad for everyone. And one of the things that was really sort of a discovery when I was writing this book, particularly the essay where I write about consent, was just all of the micro ways that we train our boys to feel entitled to women's bodies, or to be accommodated, right? Or to estrange themselves from their vulnerable feelings. Like you opened with that, and it's so important. It's really at the heart of all of this, is that to be conditioned as a child to not be vulnerable is just such a harm, like such a grave harm. And that is what we do to our boy. I mean, and like my mom was like, let's talk about our feelings. Here are some dolls to my brother. Here are some trucks to me, like correcting our children's books with a Sharpie. And it's just, it gets in, it's like smoke. It comes under the doors, like there's no way to get away from it. And so I think it's really about like cultivating an awareness that it's like, I think about my dog, right? And I had a trainer once tell me, no matter what you do, you're training your dog, right? You say something sweet to your dog when he barks, you're reinforcing his barking. You say something sweet to him when he retrieves the ball, like you're reinforcing that. Like he climbs up and licks your face and you laugh, you're reinforcing that, right? So I thought of that a lot when I was writing that essay, which is really about sort of consent and making ourselves conscious of the very small ways that we override our own boundaries to accommodate other people, women and men, right? And the ways that men are conditioned to not be clued in to the little signals and to ask for consent for all kinds of touching, not just sexual touching, not just cuddling, but like hugging, shaking hands. Like it should not be a given that we have to touch anyone that we don't want to, and this is a project for all of us. And my experience in writing the book was really one of sort of trying to do that in my own life. And I was shocked about the degree to which it was actually possible. And that is the thing that, in many ways, it's a book that deals in sort of the unspoken and the painful and the traumatic and all of those things. But I do believe it's a hopeful book, because that was my takeaway, is that healing is possible, change is possible, both in the self and in society. And those two things work together. And we can do it in our own lives, and we could do it en masse if we wanted to.
Yeah. Yes. Here. So, and so I'm going to say one more thing too, which is the Q&A box. I screwed up. It's put your questions in the Q&A box. It's easier for us to track than the chat box. But Melissa, I love that you, mentioned the smoke that's all around us, because that's where I think we can create this ethos among each other, that the smoke surrounds the women and the men. And women, listen, I believe it's my duty, right, as a woman to see it. I felt it, as an attorney, I had all the clients want to kiss me after one case, and they weren't kissing any of my male partners.
Right.
How absurd is that? So like your point, why I think the book is so important is, I think you so unflinchingly kind of address on every page, transparently, you just say it in a way that I can't recommend enough, because it never occurred to me, as those things poured into my head, that was non-consensual touching that was happening to me in the work environment. But though it had surrounded me that, listen, he's happy. He's an older gentleman. He's happy we won the case. It's okay that he literally kissed me on the lips.
Yeah.
I mean, and I processed that and went on with my day, and my partners processed it and went on with their day. And I think, I always say I'm sort of like the storm cloud in the room, because it's my job now to point out and say that wasn't okay. And I think it's so important that you talk about trauma and what would I characterize that as true trauma? No, it was, and you're like, what do you call it though?
Yeah.
Non-consensual something. So
it's really sort of proof in some ways that we don't talk about this stuff. We literally do not have words for it because we have never talked about it. And I think just the idea that we are being sort of harmed or changed or formed in these long lasting ways is still a relatively new idea. Like nobody cared for us until very recently. And so we have to make up new words for them, right? Because we know like the trauma of a car accident, the trauma of being raped, right? But when you get sort of creepy hugged by someone you don't want to, and you're like laughing it off, like, what do you even, we don't know what to call that, right? Because I just realized I don't have to do that, And it is so deep for me, just that, and I interviewed like all of these women about this subject in particular, and the degree to which like I have been taught and believed on some level that it was better to let a virtual stranger like fold my body against their body when I didn't want to, like truly didn't want to, was more important than me inducing a slightly awkward moment or making the other person feel weird about doing a creepy thing. Like that was just mind blowing. And there are just like infinite examples. Like we all know there's infinite examples of all sorts of people and children and men. And, just like as a short person, I think probably there are ways that people are like, oh, like, yeah, exactly. Oh, you're so cute. Like, no, I'm a grown woman. And like, it really changed even the way that I look at having a lunch with someone that I don't really want to, or the ways that like for years I would be like, these are my writing days, but then people would send me emails and want me to write them recommendation letters or help them move a sofa or whatever it is, have a phone call. And I was just it was so impossible for me to say no to someone else so that I could say yes to myself for a really long time. And that it's all the same sort of dynamic, right? That like my time, my labor, my body is never more important than what someone else wants, big or small. It doesn't, you know what I mean? It's like, I don't believe that, but it's in there still. And I really had to like get my magnifying glass out to be like, okay, this is when this is happening. I'm going to stop it next time and just deal with the little moment of awkwardness or whatever.
Yeah, it's those revelations that I think are so helpful to those of us who are trying to help everyone kind of recognize that we're doing it, right? And how can we change it? And so and we won't have enough time probably to talk about it in depth, but I have to recommend to people the essay Intrusions. That's tense stuff. That's truly traumatic, I think, for you to describe being stalked. Right outside your bedroom window, night after night. And I'll tell you what, I didn't want to read it because for the same observation you had, the minute I knew what that essay was about, I was like, I don't need another, as a 5'2" female, I don't need another example of how someone's going to try to torture me. Right. I've been worried about that for every year of my life.
I feel the same thing. All those murder shows, I'm like a woman. That's it. I live alone. I can't watch it.
But I have to tell you that the beauty of reading it was, I thought I was going to be afraid reading it. And instead I was angry because there was a flood of memories for me as I read that essay of every one of my friends and the stories she's told me about something nearly that scary. I'm from the generation when obscene phone calls were a thing.
Yep.
And at 16,
I got the tail end of that. Yeah.
So they're randomly somehow figured out your phone number, and then they say horribly, obnoxiously sexual things to you over the phone.
Yep.
And you picked it up because you didn't have caller ID. Like, and a friend who had to move out of her apartment because the guy exposed himself in the window the first night she moved in.
Yeah.
And there was a flood of this. So I do think there is this moment too to realize, though we're strong, has a man ever considered what it's like to go through life knowing that's gonna happen? I couldn't think of a friend that I couldn't think of a story, and I was so mad at the end.
Yeah.
Instead of afraid.
That's how I felt writing it, Kelley. It was, and this was, you know, for people who haven't read it, this was an experience where in my mid-20s, I had a ground floor apartment, and this man started coming to the window of my bedroom and like saying horrible, gross sexual things. And the first time it happened, I grabbed my dogs and I went outside and was like, yelled at him, and he tried to proposition me as if I would be like interested. It was so mind-blowing. And then he kept coming back, and I went to the police, and they basically laughed at me. And you know, it was this thing also, it was terrifying. I was tormented. I ultimately moved because of it. And I honestly never thought about it after that. And it was this weird cover-up job in my own mind, because I didn't know why. Actually, when I started writing the essay, I did not know why. I was just, I mentioned it to my partner, and she was like, I said, it wasn't a big deal. It didn't really affect me. And she was like, you taped the curtains to the window. I think it did affect you. Like, you put a shirt on to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Like, I think it did. And I was like, why do I think it didn't affect me? And then I went and made a list of all the movies I could think of that had peepers or stalkers in them, where it was romanticized or humorized or, you know, like sexualized, like so many things. And then I talked to all these people, and like, I had actually never really spoken to anyone in my 20s who had had this kind of experience, and I was truly shocked. There were so many I didn't put in the essay. My mom was peeped on as a child, like so many things. And I was like, whoa, that we've never talked about this. None of them had ever basically talked about it. Almost all of us blamed ourselves. And then it was just like, of course, when I went and looked at all these movies and interviews and songs, everything, you know, it was just like really, and I felt the same. I went back and I watched all these movies, and I was so mad. I think I mentioned this but I really walked around for a while in the streets of New York. And anytime a man came up anywhere nearby, I was just ready to sock him. Like I was like, I dare you. Like, I wish you would come near me right now. Cause I was here. It was like all this retroactive anger. And that wasn't the only time I had that experience writing this book, but it was probably the most profound. It was really intense. Yeah.
So I definitely want to thank you. I definitely want to open it up for questions and answers, or questions in the question and answer box. So if any of you are, I don't see any yet, but I will be checking those now as we're getting toward the end of our conversation.
Yeah. And let me just say, I'm happy to answer questions about anything we've talked about, but any of my previous books, or like whatever you're curious about, you know, if there's nothing I haven't been asked in the past. So I'm happy to field all manner of questions.
Yeah. And so I don't see any just yet, but I'll keep watching. Be brave, everyone. But I will say then, just to, you know, I do think that the revelation for me was, you know, there is community in that you shared that story. You allowed me to really own, you know, a little bit of fear that even I still hold on to, even in my job, doing this all the time. And, you know, I think there's a lot of people too that, you know, I thought it was interesting. And one thing I may close with here when we get, you know, is that, you know, I see a lot of the people when they talk about this book, you know, they talk about that you're addressing slut shaming. And I actually, you know, I think, of course, the topic of that word, what it means, how we use it against each other, each other, but it never occurred it almost feels too like pop culture to say that you're addressing it in that way, because you explore it so deeply. So I just wondered, you know, as you approached it, did you ever think it would kind of, that was how it get boiled down? Like, oh, she wrote an essay about slut shaming, you know, is that?
I mean, because I had written 2 previous books about topics that were like sort of easy to sensationalize in a certain way, I was not surprised or disappointed, because I know the way that things get sort of simplified. And it's interesting because, there was a way that essay was on the initial sort of outline of essays that I had planned to write for this book. And I wrote the whole book, and I didn't write that essay, and I sent the book to my editor. And then we had this like real heart to heart where she was like, didn't you mean to also write this other essay? Like, it feels like something's missing. And I thought, I've had this voice in my head the whole time that's like, oh, so many people have written about that. Like, who cares? It's been done. But I had that, I have just learned to trust my artistic impulse. Like, when I have the desire to write about something, it's because it's something I haven't read. Like, I have something to say about it and something to figure out for myself that I haven't seen anybody else write about. And I doubted myself in that moment. And then I went and wrote the essay, and it was like, went in a totally unexpected direction. And there's all of this etymology. And I really had to sort of do it for myself and have these conversations again with other women, and look at the way that sort of people with intersectional identities were experiencing it differently, and the history of it. And I'm so glad that I did, because it was the essay that I wished I could have read. It was the essay that I wanted to read. And so I trust that there are hopefully other women out there, other people out there, that it's the essay that they needed too. That's my hope.
Yeah, yeah. And so important too, I think, because that you brought out that intersectional piece, that yes, that is something that globally affects women, but what we know is that if you're a woman of color and you're experiencing it, it's going to be worse, and it's going to be different.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important, obviously, when we're addressing these important collisions, I guess, of to say that. So we do have a question, and it's a good one. I would love to get to this to myself. Suzanne asks, to what extent do you believe that your relationship with your mother made a difference for your girlhood?
Oh my God, it made all the difference. I mean, maybe not at the time. And I will say, like, you said it was 8 where girls' self-esteem starts to plummet. And I think up until 8, some girls do not have that self-esteem built up until they're 8 even. And I absolutely did. I was just loved as good as anyone can imagine. Like, I have a truly amazing parents, a wonderful mother. And she really did her best and did a really good job to protect me as much as she could. What I have come to understand, and this is something I've tried to communicate to her too, is that she couldn't see the ways that she was, I'm going to cry talking about this. She couldn't see the ways that she was protecting me in the moment, right? Because I was like taking it all in and responding, and I was working through it and experiencing it. And she had to watch that, and it was torture. I know it was, but there was a way, like, all of that love got in, right? And I think, like, I have been through so many things, and there is this, like, I don't even know how to describe it. There is this, like, core in me that is so confident and so strong and just believes that I deserve better. And it's always been there, even in the darkest parts. And she put that there. She really did, And I think the fact that I'm here talking to you, that I have written this book, that I have the kinds of relationships I do in my life, that I'm able to sort of have these, like, real intimate friendships with other women, and my student, like, all of that has to do with, like, the way I was loved and the way that I've continued to be loved my whole, like, she's like the only person I've seen during the pandemic, and just, she's my best friend. Like, we have grown together over the course of my whole life. And so I don't know, like, one of the things I really want to say to, like, all of the moms in the world is that, like, you won't see it in the moment. Like, it's working. You know what I mean? Like, it's working, and who knows when you'll get to see it, but, like, loving people works. It really does.
Yeah, that's amen. And I think I only have a son, and I often talk to mothers of adolescent. Well, when my son, he's still an adolescent for a minute. And one thing that struck me was that mothers always say to me, "Oh," and I heard this a lot of times, "You're lucky to have a boy." And it would crush me.
Yep.
And I would say to them, first of all, let's go back to those hormones that we can't control. Secondly, like, please don't let them hear you say that.
Yeah.
You know, and keep letting that love in, because you know, they're up against this ocean, right? And it's easy for me to say, because I wasn't raising a girl, but you know, I think it's so important for you to be able, now I can say Melissa said so, but
yeah.
let me share one. There was a really important comment here that I would love for you to hear. She said, I read your article on consent and wanted to thank you for your specificity describing your experience with your best friend's brother. The same thing happened to me at the same age, and it was locked away in my memory for 40 years. It was so liberating to understand it in the context of not knowing how to say no and feel that it would be heard. I found it hopeful to read about how you've practiced saying no. How do you think we can teach our boys to practice this?
Wow. Thank you, first of all, to this person for, it's so, you never know when you write something, and especially really personal things, and it goes out there, like who's reading it, who's getting it, if it's resounding the way you intended. And this is like my dream response. It's exactly what I hoped for. And I would say, like, literally just by practicing, you know, like what I have learned, and is like, it's that simple, like role playing, right? And just having those boundaries in your household, and also teaching your boys to have those boundaries with their bodies, because boys get touched all the time in ways that they don't want to be, that are just socially accepted, you know, like teaching everyone. And I think honestly, and this is really the hard part, is practicing it ourselves, you know. And that's the thing. I don't have children, but when I think about it, I think, wow, it sets the bar suddenly really high, because everything you want for your kid, you have to try to do yourself, you know, like, oh my God. But really just like, it's that thing. I've just learned this about myself. Like, I'm always reinforcing something, some idea of myself, some relationship to my own body. And I'm always modeling that for anyone who's watching, you know? So I really think just, you know, if your kid is with you in the supermarket and somebody comes up and is like standing really close, like creating the space that makes you feel comfortable, or like saying, oh yeah, I'm not really, you know, I only hug a small number of people, you know, and there are ways to make a joke about it or not, and just let it be weird and teach them that that's okay, you know? And I think also, like, at a certain point, you know better than me probably, but any parent knows better than me, but at a certain point, really just being honest with them about like possible scenarios, and saying like, what do you think you would do in that situation? And probably starting younger than we think, because by the time I was 12, I was absolutely not willing to talk about it with my mom. It was over. The window was closed, you know, and she really tried. And so I think, like, pretty young, you know, just, and actually doing role playing and saying, like, someone says like, can I kiss you? Or leans in, like, what do you do? And you say, oh, nope. You know what I mean? And just teaching them those actual skills and practicing. I really think it's that simple.
Yeah.
Not easy, simple, but not easy.
Yeah, but it's like you said, if we also condition both sides of the equation, that there's a question to be asked. I you know, I think you said, what if we weren't so spoiled? You know, what if we just weren't, you know?
Yeah, like if we hadn't been ruined already, you know, like if we just started out that way, that's how it would be. And I think that's how it can be if we start them out that way.
Yeah. So there's someone called out the fact that the book was reviewed in the New Yorker today, and that the author references a sense of, quote, non-existence, quote, as the mystery of existence for girls. Can you speak to that notion as you have about the long-term impact of that non-existence?
Sure. Well, I can't speak exactly to what Katie Waldman, the reviewer, who I'll be grateful to for the rest of my life for reviewing my book in the New Yorker, to what she meant by that. But I think it was sort of the ways she was talking about, the ways that we're taught to sort of erase ourselves, or the parts of ourselves that we're not allowed to be or bring into public life, and how they end up being these sort of private experiences. And I think for me, writing is an act of existence. It is an insistence upon existing in all of the ways that I was taught not to as a girl. And I still cringe. Sometimes even when reviewers are like, mention that I wrote about masturbating, or, you know, my sex life or whatever, I'm like, oh God, did I really write that? And it's fun, like the person, me, who's like talking to you or walking around in my life could never talk about those things in front of people. But when I'm writing, I feel totally safe. And I think I'm just going to write these things into existence because I want it to be okay. I want us to acknowledge them. I want to talk about it. I want to tolerate my own embarrassment later and just put that out there so that I can complicate and create more space for other women to be all of themselves, to fully exist.
Yeah. Yeah. So one last question that we have, and it's about the essay Kettle Holes. And she said, the image of the deep pond is so powerful as you weave it into the essay. Did you write the essay around that image, or did the image come to you after you wrote it?
So the image that this person is talking about is the image that the title comes from. There are these kinds of ponds that are really sort of specific to the Northeast where I grew up, as far as I know. And they're glacial lakes where there was a glacier and it melted. And so they're small, but they're incredibly deep. And actually the name of the pond that was sort of in my backyard as a kid was Deep Pond, capital D, Deep Pond. And it was over 50 feet at its deepest point, like super, super deep. And that becomes sort of the central metaphor and image in the essay. And I will say it happened as I was writing, right? Like I was writing about swimming, and it was really about the experience of my body changing and how confounding that was. And I started to describe the pond, and it just felt so it's just like in the way, it's like thinking but not thinking when I'm writing, and I just pulled it in. And so I would say, I guess I wrote around it, but I just wrote with it. It was just almost immediately when I started drafting it, it was entwined with my own story, which felt like a gift. It isn't always like that. Sometimes you have to figure it out and then go back and put it in. But that one just was with me the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one last one I know for Linda, and I wondered it too. Did you pick the order of the essays to sort of tell that story from sort of your youngest experiences through to almost that? Okay. Yeah. Talk a little bit just as our last.
I did. Yeah. It's not a chronological story. It jumps around a lot, but I care very much about sort of story arc, and I want things to cohere, and I want, even if it's a book of essays, I want the reader to feel like they've really arrived somewhere at the end. Like, I love that feeling when you like land at the end and it's like it moved, like you really went somewhere with that person, and so I was very, very much, there were lots of different orders before I arrived at the one that's in the book. And I really thought of like, what am I building? Like, how are, the ages chronologically, they roughly correspond, but also the ideas, the adult self who's represented, like how can each essay build on and complicate what the one before it is doing, so that at the end it really feels like you're here in the present with me. And so that was my goal.
Yeah. And I think that I had that realization sort of, I thought it was so beautiful the way the last essay, Les Calanques, talks about, it's a two stories of your younger self and your older self. And I didn't, you didn't realize what was going to happen until this. So I think you really succeeded in that last moment of like,
oh, thank you.
They're back together, they're sort of floating around.
I didn't even know that when I wrote that essay, that it was going to be this kind of perfect ending point where like there are actually images in that essay of me like embracing my young self. It just, I had no idea that I was writing the last essay in the collection, but it was a gift.
You got there. Well, there's one last thing that I wanted to end with, because I think that there was a quote, if you don't mind me reading your work.
Oh, please.
There was a quote at the end of the mirror test essay that I thought was kind of that rally that we can take with us. And you said, the only definition of the word that I claim is the one, and we're talking about the word slut. Mm-hmm. The only definition of the word that I claim is the one of a rag dipped in lard and set afire. Call me that kind of slut. Call me flashlight. Carry me through the dark if it helps. Here, take the story and watch it burn. And I will tell you, we will carry you through the darkness with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honor, Kelley. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.